Hey everybody, and welcome back. I'm Ted, your host, and this is going to be part two of our analysis of the Great Depression. And with that being said, I'd like to dive right into our lecture for today. Not going to do a recap or anything. We're just going to dive right into the factors, the commonly cited factors of the causes of the Great Depression. And picking up right where we left off, we left off looking at the decline of demand, and we're going to look at government demand. And government demand with the next argument, that government buying, government demand, the federal government had been running budget surpluses since the 1920s, really into the early 1930s. That is, the federal government was bringing in more in taxes and tariffs than it was spending. Which does take buying power out of the economy. Herbert Hoover, who was president between 1929 and 1933, has been cited as the person who did nothing to ease or help fight the Depression. We examined Hoover's role during in combating the Depression during his presidency, so we won't go into any further details with that. But I will say that this really is not an accurate description of Hoover's actions. Hoover was an engineer by training, and he led the famine relief effort at the end of World War I. And he tried to fix things. He intervened in the economy. He galvanized support for economic recovery acts. He called on the major industrialists. He called them all to the White House and urged them not to cut employee wages. He urged them to take a hit to their profits instead. Now, that was a watershed moment. It was really momentous. Hoover increased government spending on public works like roads, bridges, and dam construction. Hoover urged that taxes be cut to stimulate the economic recovery. And by 1932, more than half of all federal spending was deficit spending because of the tax cuts. And Hoover's administration spending increases were aimed at creating more demand. Now, there was a problem with that, and there was a major problem with the Hoover in general, with Hoover's plan, I should say, in general. And that was in 1932. Hoover had to run for re-election in 1932, and he had to run against Franklin Roosevelt, who was then relatively unknown on the national scene. He had been Undersecretary of the Navy. He had rebounded from being struck down with the illness of polio to become the vice presidential candidate and governor of New York, and he had set his sights on the presidency. Roosevelt, at every turn, confronted Hoover over having an imbalanced budget. So Hoover, fearing that an electoral defeat, he began to raise taxes, which was detrimental to a previous, very sensible economic recovery policy. Roosevelt, for his part, quickly abandoned his promises of a balanced budget. Once he gained the presidency, in 1936, at the end of his first term, the budget was over 50% higher than it had been in 1932, and way beyond balancing. The decline in investment and the increase in taxes did not help the situation on Hoover's end. Excuse me. The rise in taxes helped to prolong the depression. However, neither were factors in explaining what triggered the depression in the first place. Lastly, we will look at the Hawley tariff of 1930. And really that all factors into foreign trade. And the main draw here for foreign trade is really the Hawley tariff. This act began as a protective move for agrarian interests from foreign trade. And this really grew to include just about everything being produced or being exported from the United States. the average tax paid on imports leapt from 25 to 50%. In a remarkable moment of industry solidarity, over 1,000 economists signed the petition against the tariff. Now, while the Smoot-Hawley tariff certainly did not help the situation, it cannot be singled out as the root cause of the Depression or why the Depression continued for so long. At the time, international trade was about 5% of the United States economy. It is unreasonable to single out this relatively minor segment, created to single out this minor segment and label it as the cause of the Depression. So now we're forced to examine, in our analysis, we're forced to examine even more issues that confronted the United States economy. We're forced to really look at it and say, well, what else could have contributed to the rise of conditions that made the Depression possible, and then what also fueled those conditions to make the Depression inevitable and prolong its life. And one of them would be mismanagement of monetary policy. Through the 1920s, money flowed freely and was readily available. But in 1928, observers grew worried and tightened access to the money. The rate that the money was available declined 20% by 1931. There was much less credit and much less buying power available, which proved detrimental to the economy. The Federal Reserve restricted money and access. The interest rates were very low, and there were enormous deflation prices, which meant that credit was not really available at all. Credit also was also negatively impacted by the sheer volume of bank failures. Now, the banks began to fail in the 1930s, and the number of bank failures increased. In the next couple of years, between 1930 and 1933, 9,000 banks suspended operations. The majority of which were small banks in rural areas. And in these rural areas, this was especially devastating to their local economies because none of the banks diversified. They were all tied into the local farming economy. When the farms began to fail, the banks began to fail. In urban areas, as banks fell, it became difficult for investors to gain access to credit, to find readily available capital, or to make factory modifications. Now, the disruption of the banking system magnified what was going on. And in looking at the fiscal policies, the money policies, we also have to remember that the United States was on a gold standard at the time. The economic leaders felt that it was imperative to have a large source of gold. In the 1930s, the United States starts to lose gold to European nations. The Federal Reserve tried to stop this by raising interest rates from 1.5% to 3.5% to attract gold back into the country. Now, this is a good way to attract gold, but also a good way to hurt the economy. A 3% increase A 3% interest rate coupled with a 5% deflation rate is more like an 8% real interest rate, which means that the interest rates are continuing to rise. A number of prominent economic historians have argued that what really led to the Great Depression was a number of countries trying to attract gold by raising their interest rates against one another, which meant they all hurt their economies in an effort to compete with one another. There were 47 major industrial countries on the gold standard in 1931. By 1932, there were only 7. Countries like Japan and United Kingdoms that switched quickly, they got off the gold standard, that is, had a much swifter economic recovery than countries that didn't. So to summarize, an ordinary stock market crash and recession coupled with mismanagement of money supply influenced bank failures, influenced by bank failures, crop failures, and the problems with the gold standard, Hoover's tax spike and the smooth Hawley Tariff Act further worsened the economic situation. So, and looking at the Depression, we sort of just narrowed it down to a convoluence of a convoluence of issues of ill health, of ill economic health issues that brought him down. One of the analogies that I like to make with classes is a man, a bank robber, gets shot by the cops. He runs into a burning building and dies. He runs into the burning building. He falls to his knees because of the smoke, and then the building collapses. What killed him? Was it the gunshot? Was it the fire, smoke inhalation, or the building collapsing? You know, it's hard to really choose. So you attribute it to all. A coroner might disagree, but we for our purposes we attribute it to all. All of these things came together to create the perfect storm that created the Great Depression. Now Roosevelt sweeps into office in 1932. Well, really 1933. Elected in 32, takes office in 33, and with a great majority of the popular vote and a huge party majority in both houses of Congress, and largely guided by an emphasis on strong, positive action, trying to rectify the situation. This is the environment that the New Deals, plural, there were two of them, are crafted. Now, there was no clear indication what action Roosevelt would really take. It was almost Roosevelt coming into power in 1933 is much like Andrew Jackson coming into power for his first term. Nobody really knew what the man was going to do. Some people didn't believe in him, some people believed in him, but mostly people just didn't know what to expect. They didn't know what was going to happen. It became apparent that an air of simply talking or taking any action was the first course that the administration was going to take. The New Deal is simply the term applied to all of the legislation passed after Roosevelt took office. And in the first 100 days, Congress passed 15 major laws covering a very wide scope. Many contradicted each other. Many of these acts contradicted one another and were struck down by the Supreme Court. One of the areas the New Deal focused on was industrial regulation. The National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933, which set up the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, and really that administration was charged with setting up codes of regulation for every industry. There were codes that would go into great depth to cover the amount charged for a product, the marketing allowed for a product, the wages to be paid to workers, the typical length of a workday, all of these things. And a month after that, the passage of this act, more than 200 such codes were created. They were decided. It was decided that. It was decided that it was not really fast enough, that the actions being taken weren't really being taken swiftly enough. So a national code was set up. You had these various industry codes, steel workers, coal miners, radio manufacturers, oil men, automobiles, all these different codes, glass making, rubber making, gasoline, all these different industries, all these different codes came up, but they weren't coming into play fast enough. They weren't having a fast enough effect on the national economic life. So a really broad national structure was envisioned and brought into life. And it was and this national code was brought on to spur recovery uniformly across the republic. You didn't want one area recovering faster than another. That was the logic behind all of this. That was the thinking. Now, what the NRA did was to set up a government-run or approved monopoly where all the businesses could come together and agree not to undercut each other with prices. For the government, they wanted to hold up production and keep up production and keep wages high, most importantly. By 1934, 95% of workers were covered by the NRA, by the codes established by the NRA. But the fact that the government regulation aimed at keeping prices high was not lost on anyone, and the Supreme Court struck it down in 1935. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was designed to help farmers return to their prime years, the years to the 19 teens, where they had enjoyed high domestic sale rates and high foreign sale rates, as they were needed to have their goods were sold to Europe, then devastated by the influenza and various wars, notably World War One. This act passed to federally back farmers in the event of crop failures. Commodity prices were guaranteed to farmers so that they could get the best possible price for their crops. The federal food stamp program was developed to increase demand for food and to keep the price high. They set up the school lunch program with the view that it would increase demand for food and keep the price where it was at. These are thought of as programs designed to help the poor, but really they were all designed with the main intent to help farmers, to stop the slide of the old agrarian interest. And with that being said, we'll break here and we'll come back for the third and final part of our analysis of the Great Depression. As always, I am Ted. Hit like, subscribe, comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture.